Have you ever thought that the music you listened to on the radio or on social media wasn't always the same decades ago? What type of music were your parents or grandparents listening to 60 years ago? Without the popularity of rock and roll during the 1950s, music would have not evolved. According to the evolution of rock music, Americans, especially teenagers, changed their music taste when the new genre called rock and roll came during the 1950s, and that's when music changed. My name is Adriana Lucas, and I will inform you about the rock and roll culture, the history of it, Mexican rock and roll, and its famous icons. When people think about rock and roll, many people think of the 1950s, simply because during that decade, rock and roll was at its highest peak. According to U.S. history, rock and roll comes from African rhythms such as blues and gospel music. These rhythms attracted white teenagers. Ever wonder who invented rock and roll? It isn't clear who invented rock and roll, but many people think that Chuck Berry and Little Richard invented rock and roll because they were black musicians. According to Scott Rufy, due to racism, radio stations did not promote Little Richard or Chuck Berry and other black musicians. Instead, they will promote Elvis Presley and other white musicians. And that's why there's a misconception who invented rock and roll. According to the New York Sun, Elvis Presley was heavily influenced by black gospel music since he would listen to it on the radio. Presley himself never claimed that he invented rock and roll, although he did help to popularize the music. When rock and roll was at its highest peak, many parents of teenagers thought that rock and roll was rebel and bad for teenagers. And also parents was afraid that black kids and white kids will start to hang out together. Many parents also thought that rock and roll was too sexualized and vulgar during that time. According to our pastimes, teenagers had their own style and they will spend money on clothing and records. Now that I have informed you about the history of rock and roll in America, Mexico's rock and roll history is quite interesting too. The history of rock and roll in Mexico is like America's. Rock and roll became popularized in Mexico from the borders, and it was heavily influenced by American culture. Unlike in America, rock and roll did not become a thing in Mexico until the late 50s through the 60s. According to BBC News, during the 50s and 60s, the Mexican government and society did not support rock and roll because they also thought that rock and roll was bad, rebel. They thought that it was a bad influence for the new generation of Mexicans. Mexicans wanted to stick with their Mexican traditional music such as rancheras, corridos, mariachi. According to BBC News, many groups such like Los Teen Tops, Los Rebeldes del Rock and Roll, decided to, instead of creating their own songs, they would make Spanish covers of American music. The first Spanish cover of rock and roll was created by Gloria Rios in 1957. She made a cover of Rock Around the Clock in Spanish, which she translated into El Relojito. There were more covers in Spanish, such as like La Plaga by Los Teen Tops, which is Jailhouse Rock by Elvis Presley, Bule Bule by Los Rocket Devils, which was from Wooly Bully from Sam the Sham, Susie Q by Los Absons, which is from Rolling Stones. The following musicians helped shape rock and roll history and popularize among teenagers and from that decade. One of them is Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley is one of the popular icons from the 20th century. He is also known as the King of Rock. He is mostly known for his famous song Jailhouse Rock. Although many people think he invented rock and roll, he helped make this genre make it more popularized in America. Presley influenced the new generation of Americans from that decade. Chuck Berry is known to be the father of rock and roll. Many believe that he was the one who invented rock and roll. One of his famous songs is Johnny B. Good, and he inspired many artists like Billie Holiday and Elvis Presley. And the last one I'm going to talk about is the Mexican group Los Absons. They were a rock and roll group from a border town in Sonora. The group's name is after their town, Agua Prieta, Sonora. Since the group was from the border town, American music inspired them to bring rock and roll in Mexico by making Spanish covers versions. Hopefully you have learned something from the rock and roll culture or generally about music history. I have informed you about the characteristics of rock and roll culture, including the history, the impact of it, and famous artists from that decade. Next time you hear a song from 70 or 60 years ago, remember on how this music impacted society and changed music and people's likes from that decade.